Okay, so we're kind of picking back up with some ideas from the last presentation from a couple of weeks ago, which were my attempts to kind of develop a theory around why critical digital literacy is important or significant, something for us to consider kind of building into whatever pedagogical space we're operating in. And today I have much fewer pictures of exciting things like slide rules and more kind of like nuts and bolts examples of how this kind of theory ends up making a difference in the classroom. So I have fewer kind of comments to give you and more just a couple of things that I'd like to show off or kind of demonstrate, and then, bless you, and then take some questions as we go along about how these things work. I imagine that everybody to some extent is experimenting with technology in their classrooms, whether that's through Moodle. I mean, if everyone on campus is using Moodle, then you're already in essentially a digital space. But I'd like to kind of start examining how multiple spaces where we operate and where students operate can end up becoming kind of like network nodes for a new kind of literacy pedagogy. And I wanted to start with this kind of long quote because it's going to be helpful for me to draw out of this a kind of binary distinction between two ways to apply this kind of critical digital literacy. So this is a quote from Kathleen Fitzpatrick's essay inside of a book called Debates in the Digital Humanities. And let me see hands of people who are familiar with that discourse, digital humanities. Is that something that sounds familiar to you? Okay, maybe half of us. Digital humanities is an interesting kind of sub-field or field, however you want to describe it, to look at for me because people in digital humanities, for the most part, are applying digital methodologies to their research. And there's always this weird thing that happens when somebody comes into a DH space or conference or whatever and starts talking about pedagogy. Because certainly our research and our pedagogy are connected, but people often are thinking about them in two completely different ways. This is the way that several years ago, Kathleen Fitzpatrick tried to kind of define what digital humanities were for her. And the main thing that I want to point to is this distinction that she gives here. I wrote that the digital humanities could be understood as a nexus of fields within which scholars use computing technologies to investigate the kinds of questions that are traditional to the humanities, so bracket that, that's one. Or, as is more true of my own work, ask traditional kinds of humanities-oriented questions about computing technologies. So it's either either the digital stuff takes over the content or the digital stuff takes over the methodology, and she's kind of making a distinction between those two. That's useful for me when I'm thinking about how this stuff relates to the classroom, because I have a similar kind of binary situation that I think about when I think about doing digial work in a classroom. And it essentially breaks into this. If we're going to hybridize or infuse a classroom with some kind of digital work, it ends up manifesting in one or two ways. Either we have the same kinds of conversations and content and questions and debates that we've had before we started thinking about how the internet can change the classroom, and we move that kind of work into networked, connected spaces. And people will say, well, why do you do that? I mean, why invest the extra effort? If something is working, if a kind of critical face-to-face discussion over a reading in class works, why would you move it into a digital space? And the short answer is sometimes you shouldn't. There's no definite essential value to moving that kind of a pedagogical activity into a networked, connected experience. But sometimes there are, because sometimes you want a record of that discussion, or sometimes you want other people who aren't in the classroom to be able to participate in that discussion. Or sometimes you want to teach a kind of inquiry that is important and that is kind of developing in digital space that doesn't happen when people learn to talk to each other. And this is I always think about this as the fact that we don't ever think about how either our students or our children, however we want to think about people that we teach. We don't often think about taking a student or one of our own children into a room full of people that are talking and saying, right now I'm going to teach you how to talk to a bunch of people. It just happens because they end up in rooms full of people, and sometimes they learn how to navigate that well and sometimes they don't. We don't usually kind of front load that kind of instruction. But in digital space, sometimes it's really important to teach people how networked conversation happens. Because if you dump students into a discussion forum or a Twitter hashtag chat or some kind of larger global discussion space like Reddit or something, students sometimes just, they really shut down. They lurk, which is a fine thing to do in the beginning, but they feel maybe intimidated, like how does this community work? I don't understand how to participate. And so it's good sometimes for us to model how that kind of discussion works. Those are all examples of how we take content or disciplines that we already teach, and the reasons why potentially we would infuse that kind of inquiry in a digital space. The second side of that coin, though, is taking the kinds of methodologies that we've always been using in the humanities or whatever your discipline is, and folding those questions into what happens in online space in general. So picking digital spaces, digital communities as the kind of thing that we're going to investigate and folding methodological questions on top of that. So if you're in sociology, for instance, like how do we look at what's happening in a specific part of the internet? I keep having Reddit like springing up in my mind, but how can we look at a bunch of people piling on to comments that are appended to a New York Times article? How can we look at that sociologically, like what's happening? How are they talking to each other? What are they revealing? How are authorities being asserted or points being made? So there's essentially these two kinds of ways that I always think about how digital work can happen pedagogically. And I'm just going to kind of bring up some examples, and I'll point back later on to how you can get back to this if you want to see any of these examples. These are links to that I'm going to show you to projects or assignments that I've done in a classroom. This is a really simple example. In Google Docs, as probably everybody knows, you can build documents that can be collaboratively authored. So you open a Google Doc, you mess with the share settings, you rip the link off of the doc, and in some way you share it with your students or whatever community you're going to work with. And you can tweak the settings so that people can either only view the document or comment on the document, like these comments on the side, or that they can actually write inside the document. So this is an example of one of the first, well, not one of the first, but one of my earliest iterations of taking my syllabi and turning them into Google Docs and coming in on the first day of class and saying, this is kind of the plan that I have for us for this semester, but one of the first assignments for you is to read the syllabus and to kind of pepper it with comments on the side. Things that you're questioning, things that you don't understand, responses, just like, oh, like this is interesting, I like this, or this looks like a lot of work, or whatever. Engage with the document. And I usually tell students as I'm opening up some kind of like a syllabus or an assignment sheet or something, I say this is a skeleton, and whatever kind of dialogue we're going to have in the comments next to the text that I have, I will take the pieces of that we decide are important, and I'll fold that back in. So I will rebuild a syllabus or an assignment sheet after we've had kind of a long chained out conversation about it. Let's see if I can pull out a really interesting one. I mean, this is just an example of, I feel like I have done a good job on the first day of class when I can have students feel comfortable about just kind of like in a kind of brainstorming way to just respond to content that I'm giving them. So this was a student who's saying, his comment is attached to this. part of the syllabus, that he's glad that like blogging is going to be a part of the course, and I'm responding back to him there. And sometimes these kinds of conversations will spill out on the side of the document, and more people will follow up with more questions, and then I'll say, okay, I realize when we come back into class I'm going to have to like formalize this language. I'll come in with an answer to this question and I'll build it back into the syllabus. So this is one example. So for me, this serves two purposes, and it seems really simple, but one is it teaches the skill of engagement. In the beginning, it kind of mandates engagement, which I'm always like nervous about, to say you must engage, and if you've engaged, then you've learned how to engage. Well, not really. Like if I've made you engage, then the engagement that you're learning is a kind of forced, but I'm trying to turn it into a habit from the first day of the semester. The second thing that it does is it proves, hopefully, to students that how I'm going to build the class is essentially like a perforated membrane. That there's going to be lots of points along through the semester where things are kind of malleable and where we can get in and manipulate them and change them according to the needs of the community. But I would say that being able to read and respond to a document like this, and to follow along with conversations like these, and to participate in kind of civil, polite discourse, and to ask good questions, these are literacies, really, that we're learning, that plenty of people are comfortable maybe raising their hand and expressing, maybe not so much as expressing it here. However, also the converse is true. Also, I've found that when I release a document like this, that I will have a student 2 months into the semester who will show up on the assignment sheet and write all kinds of comments. And this person never raises her hand in class, never speaks. But that there's something about this interface that makes that student feel comfortable kind of like ripping things apart and saying, I don't understand what this is about. Chris?
Is this sort of feedback purely voluntary?
In the beginning, it's mandatory.
You said something about that, but do you have like a deadline? Like you have to make one comment by this date, or?
In the beginning, like between day 1 and day 2 of the class, yes, because I want them to demonstrate to me they can open the Google document, they can find the comment button, they can find something in the syllabus to engage with. So yes, it is, but I think that I can't think of a time but after like day 2 of a class when I'm mandating that kind of thing. But there was something else to your question too that I was hearing, like like deadlines. Google will send you alerts when somebody's messed with something that you own or commented on something that you own. And so sometimes I will find that people have gone back to something that we're not really even using or looking at anymore, and they put a comment on it. But usually, if somebody does that, they kind of understand that I'm not necessarily looking out for that kind of thing to happen, and that if they need me to answer to something, they might need to like send me an email or something to go back and look at that thing. It's kind of assumed that once we're finished with a document, I'm not going to be going back there and looking for things. So it's usually like, from now until the time we see each other face to face again, talk on this thing. Yeah.
So there's no point during the semester where the syllabus is actually fixed. I mean, it's a dynamic document throughout the course.
For me, yes.
Okay.
I guess I'm answering that so certainly because of the way that I recoil from the word fixed. And that gets to like a really, like a larger philosophical question about documents and web pages, and how web pages are never necessarily fixed and how documents always are. Theoretically, you can write on them and box them out and stuff. There are some things I can't imagine ever tweaking on this thing, especially after about the 3rd or 4th week of the semester. But I guess I would say that yes, I would agree that it's never fixed, because this language is always something that's worth going back to and discussing and sometimes renegotiating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm sure. I realize that. That's a really big paradigm shift. Especially for something like a syllabus where it's You know, I think even if the professor invites comments on it at the beginning of the course, it's typically at some point, you know, locked.
Right.
It's like a legal document.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you'll see that there are parts of the syllabus and probably every syllabus in the world where, you know, notice nobody commented on that stuff.
Well, most of the comments were for clarification too, like, is YouTube okay? And I just recently found that even though it's all in my syllabus, a lot of students were confused about what I wanted for a presentation. It might have been nice to have this discussion in this way.
Well, the other thing I think you ensure when you say they must engage between day 1 and day 2 is that they've read the syllabus.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I think that's interesting in the paradigm shift is that it actually, if indeed they have, if everybody has put their name on it somewhere, then it then becomes a mutual agreement. So that should changes happen, it's mutually agreed upon that everybody's in it together and collaboratively they're on board.
There are also some documents that I'll release to students or share with students where they have editing rights on the document, so they can go in and like generate text. But I don't do that on the syllabus because that's a level of negotiation that I'm not yet comfortable with. And these are comments I left on this document when I like on day 2 or day 3 of the syllabus of the course. Usually there's big long strings of them. But I think it also points to a really important, now you're bringing up this idea of a paradigm shift. There is a kind of pedagogy, and I want to make like neutral, non-evaluative statements. There's a kind of pedagogy that kind of depends on things being very set from day 1 to the final day of the semester. And there are syllabi that have every reading that's going to happen attached to a specific day, and every assignment due date, and every project workshop day or whatever, firmly built into the structure of the course, whether it's in the syllabus or somewhere else. And I'm not that guy. And I can imagine that if I were that guy, this would be harder. But I don't think it would be impossible if I had that kind of attachment to structure to iterate towards something like this in small little places and in parts of my pedagogy. It kind of also points to another thing that whole paradigm, that idea of a paradigm shift brings up, is that when you start dealing with Google Docs or Twitter or any kind of digital platform or methodology that you haven't dealt with before, you're opening the door to there being students, maybe most of the students, coming in and having figured out things about that platform that you don't know. So they're teaching it to you. So you're saying, oh, I thought this was going to work this way. And they're saying, no, actually it worked this other way. Here's how I figured it out. Here's the workaround that I built. That is a paradigm shift too. And I think that having a flexible schedule is something that you don't necessarily have to do to move towards this kind of a pedagogical idea. But I think that the idea that you have to learn with your students is. I think the idea that you have to be okay with the fact that 25 people working within a system that's dynamic and that's always changing and that sometimes goes down and sometimes gets updated and new features are added. There are sometimes when they're just going to know how that thing works better than you do. And that kind of inflexibility, I think, is incompatible with thinking about critical digital literacy, because this whole stuff depends on change. It depends on things adapting and iterating. It depends on there being room for things to develop rather than everything being set. Okay. Here's another example. So, if we looked at if we looked at that syllabus, you would see that for a long time I've been tinkering with a statement in my syllabus that says something like this: we're going to be using Twitter in specific ways. I'm asking you to set up a Twitter account. And it doesn't matter if you ever use Twitter again after this class is over. It's okay if you walk away from it. Usually, even now, I have language in there that says it's okay if you don't even play yourself on Twitter. So I don't require that students put their first and last names into the Twitter account. If they don't, then I usually have them just let me know and indicate to me that they're using, that they're naming themselves other than their actual birth name. And I also tell students when they're going to use Twitter that if you've used Twitter before, it's a good idea for you to open a different Twitter account for the kind of discussion that we're going to be having in here. You don't have to, but it's good for you to, because when you go out to that concert and you're out till like 3 o'clock in the morning and you've taken a bunch of really cool pictures and you decide at 8 o'clock in the morning that you're calling it a day and you're going to sleep in, if we pull up a hashtag chat or if we pull up something that has everybody, the Twitter accounts that people are using in class, you don't want to be the person who's not there and we see like the 3 pictures from the concert that you posted at 2:30 in the morning. I lay that out there as a warning, not a warning, but like as a cautionary tale, because I've had that happen in class before, at which point I walked out and I was like, please tell students if they really use Twitter, don't consider building another Twitter account. Which brings us to 2 other questions. One is the idea of identity and how, people say, well, if you're not yourself on Twitter, then, everything is a lie and you're really just performing. I mean, that whole idea of performance is one that we could really interrogate, and the fact that when you walk into a classroom, you're already kind of performing in a way that you don't perform in other places. And it opens up lots of opportunities to kind of ask people to flip back and forth between the Twitter account that they've been using through class and their own Facebook profile that they use that has nothing to do with school. What are the differences there? How are you speaking, connecting, liking, sharing things in one space and another space? What do you learn about yourself from looking at that? I've had kind of reflective assignments sometimes before where I ask people after using an academic social media platform or using a social media platform in an academic way to reflect on, what are the ways that you use other social media platforms, and are you fine? Is it okay with the fact that you're kind of 2 different people there, or, is that something that's worth talking about? But this is a hashtag that we've been, or this is a related hashtag that we've been using all semester for my film as literature class. And the way that this works is we watch, it's a really fun class. It's not a very theory-heavy class. Most of the students in the class come from the program that's called New Media Arts in my department. So they've studied, they've made films, they're usually doing lots of drawing and animation projects, and they get to this class and they're kind of studying film as an aesthetic experience. Like what does it mean to walk out of a film and to evaluate it? So the class is, every week we watch 10 films over the course of the semester, and every time we watch a film, the class is divided into 3 groups, and they thresh themselves, and this all happens on the learning management system that I use. And so they pick one of 3 different jobs, and one of the jobs is always live tweeting while you're watching the movie. The reason I split people is because when you have 25 people live tweet a movie over the weekend, that Twitter stream it's just as unwieldy as having 25 people blogging at the same time. 25 people blogging at the same time is just almost unconscionable. If you think that you or the class is going to have kind of a comprehensive record of what everyone's talking about all the time. They aren't. Here, we basically get 7 or 8 people who are giving us their meandering brain path through the movie, and that's doable. The class usually can read the entire hashtag of what other people thought while they were watching the movie before they come in to discuss it. And I tell them, we work in the first film that we watch, I'm asking them to just respond. I'm not giving any kind of direction. Just sit there with your computer or your phone and pause every couple of minutes or whatever and react as if your friend were sitting next to you. And through the first 3 movies, we look at the Twitter chat and I try to start moving people towards kind of making their commentary on the hashtag more critical. Like, where are you going to find places to compare this movie with other things? Where are you going to find ways to contrast how a character acts in the beginning or the end of a movie? Where are you going to find places where there's a still from the movie that's just like really important to you, and you're going to link that into the Twitter chat? I try to move the discussion into increasingly kind of critical spaces, but I never say, don't just stop responding to the movie in the way that you also, that you enjoy. Because, with a tweet like this, that's just fun. He's not trying to make an argument, really, at least not an academic one. He's basically just saying, this is when we watched Birdman this past weekend, the Michael Keaton movie. He's just kind of riffing off the top of his head.
But he's also making a filmic illusion.
Say again?
He's also making a filmic illusion.
Right.
So you have everybody read everybody else's, the 8 people's Twitter comments, and then you come in and have a discussion?
Yes.
Based on that as the text?
Kind of, yes. But I'll show in a second how there's another activity working simultaneously that requires some people to have a really strong working knowledge of this thing. So it would be another step aside from this. I want everybody to read this before they come in. But somebody could say, well, if you ask students to read something and you don't assess whether they've read that thing, then why would you ask them to do it at all? I'm not going to give somebody a quiz on whether I'm not going to make a quiz out of the Twitter chat because I just find that ridiculous. I don't think that would be a useful use of students' time. I do encourage people to start having conversations, and you can see that in a lot of places that's not happening. We don't have as much time to work on kind of new media as a platform in this class because we're talking about films, but you see, there's one person tweeting the movie. There's another person tweeting the movie. There's another person. What I'm looking for a lot of times, at least mostly in other classes, is where people start talking back and forth to each other. Here's an example. This is Morgan answering a tweet from somebody else. In fact, we could probably look at what that looks like. This is Angela tweeting out the thesis for her final project, and Morgan popping in and saying, oh, I think that, your thesis would become interesting if you did it this way. So we've used it that way. This is worth a pause too, this is annoying and gross. This is the kind of thing that social media platforms do that we wish they didn't do, or that I wish they wouldn't do. And to the extent that this happens more and more on Twitter, I get less and less loving Twitter. This is like the day that before I had my own domain, where I would kind of blog for class on a WordPress.com site, and I came in one day to pull up something that I had published and to talk about it with my students, and there were ads. WordPress.com had put ads on my blog post, and I was like, oh man, I have to change now. I can't do that. This is evidence of a negotiation that we're making with Twitter. Twitter is a useful platform. It's public. It's easy to use. It's on your phone. But that means that this kind of stuff has to pop up. And sometimes, not as many times as I would like, but sometimes as I'm asking people to use Twitter, or sometimes I've had people use Tumblr, we spend a day or a half a day pulling up the terms and conditions that they just automatically click the box in, because that's what we all do. Pulling that document up and saying, what is this doing? What is it asking you? What is it keeping for itself? What is it giving you back? There's a really interesting, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a whole kind of nonprofit or EDU project going on where this group of people are going through terms of service of media platforms and doing these really thorough kind of legalistic reads of what those things say, and then evaluating them, grading them A to E. More open, less open. Here's what we've learned. They've changed it this way. This is an interesting site. Yeah.
What did you do with a student who somebody in your class who doesn't want to do this with Twitter or Tumblr or whatever?
I would do, it would depend on the class, because when I have done this kind of stuff in English 1101 classes, one way that I've approached that is to say, I'm pouring a lot of, like we're working with new media a lot in this class. It's kind of the focus of this class. There are, at least when I was at Georgia State, there are 150 other English 1101 classes. I completely respect that you don't want to use this one, which is fine because you and I can do a workaround. But if working in public is going to be something that is going to be difficult for you or uncomfortable for you, then it might be better for you to have a more traditional English 1101 class where it's this one-to-one teacher to professor kind of thing. At the other end of the spectrum, when I'm working with like new media arts students in our program, a massive part of their education, their portfolio, their whole professional development is, they have to prove that they have facility with social media. So on that end of the spectrum, I would also kind of say, we need to talk about this. If it's just Twitter that you don't like, we can figure that out. But if it's being in public that you don't like, let's have a conversation about what that means. In the middle, I would be less and less kind of like attached to the idea. So I've had literature classes before, like kind of 2000 level literature classes, where we did some work on Twitter, almost like where we like live tweeted while we were reading a short story or whatever. But those students who are going to other departments, they're potentially economics or nursing or whatever, I'm like, we can do this a different way. Okay, so I said that I was going to kind of show what happens, like what we do with this. Because, yeah, Chris?
Sorry, kind
No.
of like this. So why do Twitter instead of Moodle discussion forum, where you don't have these terms of service and advertising issues?
Mm-hmm. I'm building a good response to that.
I mean,
No, I mean,
I'm just curious what your opinion is. I mean, I think there are advantages. I
Yeah.
just don't know that I'm thinking of all of them.
I think that and I don't want to like beat up on Moodle. I think that in a closed system, a closed academic system, the audience is your peers in the classroom. And I think that on Twitter, potentially, your audience is this huge, vast, mysterious group of people that you don't know. And that sometimes tweeting in public about smart things that you're doing just fortuitously like means that you engage with other people. So for instance, I had a colleague who came across my syllabus. I don't know, I presented somewhere and she saw the syllabus, the film is literature syllabus, and she emailed me and she said, I really like this class, I like the movies that you're teaching, I'd really love to like participate in that discussion. And I could just send her the hashtag and say, like, I know you use Twitter, you could jump into this hashtag whenever you want, and you could pick one film and one weekend that we're watching that film, and you'd have 7 people to talk to about that movie and kind of see how that works. And I have had people jump in and do that before. There's another slide coming where I was tweeting about something that happened in class with respect to a textbook that we were reading, and because I was kind of maybe 2 steps removed through a friend with one of the authors of the book, that tweet got to the author. The author came back and tweeted back to me about the book on the hashtag that I was using with my students. So in like 2 hours from walking out of class, the author of the textbook was engaging with a discussion that we were having in class on Twitter. And that can't happen in Moodle. It's like the whole small pond, big pond thing. I think there are benefits to both. I'm not saying that Twitter is necessarily essentially better than a closed kind of chat system. Yeah.
But I mean, isn't there a dark side of that too? I mean, if somebody set out to sabotage your discussion for whatever reason, basically troll the discussion.
Yep.
I mean, that's a possibility too.
Yep.
So so somebody doing this for a class necessarily has to be prepared for that eventuality.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that somebody who turns on a computer and connects it to the internet has to be ready for that. I think that like trolls exist, and that I've never had any significant work that I was doing with students get trolled that way, but I certainly have read accounts from colleagues of mine who have. And I think that, you know, that's one of those situations that unless it gets abysmally bad, which might make you decide, I really don't want to do this anymore, the way that you deal with it is really the important thing. Yeah.
And it's certainly a literacy.
Yeah.
Teaching women.
Yep. Yep. I mean, in my head, I'm going through like every kind of example of this that I've read about where it's gone really awful, and trying to think like, would that make me come off of Twitter? Would that make me come off of Twitter?
Isn't it possible also that the hashtags you're using may be less likely to attract trolls if you use a hashtag Werner Herzog?
That's true.
Go like, I'm not really going to enter that discussion.
That's true, yeah. We see, like, we're looking at the stream of everyone in the entire planet using Twitter with the hashtag DWMA3180. It's all my students. You know, people aren't just like stumbling onto that hashtag. However, you know, the minute that and Birdman is probably a kind of weird, wonky tag to use that could mean a bunch of different things. But let me see when we get to. You know, I mean, here's when we were tweeting about Wall-E. You know, that having that hashtag on that tweet might mean that somebody else who's tweeting about Wall-E comes across the tweet and looks at the string. So theoretically, yeah, you could get a kind of ill person showing up because of that. And I think that you just deal with that the way that you deal with it. You know, another thing that happens sometimes is that hashtags can get kind of spammed. So if you have, I don't know if you've ever gone to an academic conference where everybody on Twitter is using one hashtag, but sometimes you get a day into the conference and all the spam bots have seen that there's 300 people tweeting on this one hashtag, and you start getting, you know, like, you know, ads for stuff that has nothing to do with the conference showing up in the Twitter feed because they just see that people are using it. But again, like iteration, revision, like Twitter users will basically just go, okay, like the spam bot has arrived, we're going to revise it, we're going to change the hashtag and go somewhere else. And that's, you know, that's just part of digital activity, I think. I'll make sure I get to this. Okay, so I mentioned that in the film as literature class, a third of the class is tweeting. Another third of the class is doing research. So they're into the library database system, and they're pulling up kind of like film studies papers on the movies that we're reading. They're picking one source that they specifically like and building a bibliographic link into the course management system and giving an annotation of that article. So at the end of a weekend where we watched, you know, Her or 2001 or something like that, there's 5 like academic articles that different students have found and annotated and are bringing back to the class. The other third do this analysis job where they have to write a relatively short, like 250 to 400 word analysis short essay about the film. And when they do that, they have to reference either the Twitter stream or one of the articles that somebody linked in on the in other words, they have to use as a source the Twitter conversation or the research that people are dropping onto the learning management system. And here's what that looks like. This is Tiffany. She's writing an analysis post on Memento, which is one of the first films that we watch. And she's embedding tweets from the tweet stream in with her analysis. And the thing that I really love about that, and we get to this in like the second or third week of class, is that without any specific kind of direction, I can walk into class and pull up that Twitter stream from a movie that we've watched and pull a tweet off of the stream and say, you know, like Ty said, you know, whatever, like Birdman has why use a cape if you don't have wings? Like, let's have a conversation about, you know, like superheroes that have capes and superheroes that don't have capes, and like let's talk through that. Like why a cape? What does a cape do? What is the ethos of the superhero cape? Anything like that. And relatively quickly, you can take a tweet that seems kind of inane, and you can embed it in a discussion that's like a really critically involved, even contentious premise about the film. For instance, how many people have seen this movie, No Country for Old Men? Okay, so there's a scene, that's another movie that we watched, there's a scene at the end of that movie where the bad guy seems to be hiding behind a door, ready to get the good guy, but then that doesn't happen, and so it's unclear in the movie whether that guy is actually there or whether he's not there. So somebody, when we watch the film, somebody inevitably tweets, wait a minute, is he there or is he not there? And it's so useful to pull that comment out and say, let me develop for you my thesis about why he is there. You develop the thesis for me about why he's not there. Bang one against the other, like let those two thesis statements fight their way out. Which one do you think wins? What evidence would you marshal? And then you've gone from Twitter as like a brainstorming, skimming ideas right off the top of your head into Twitter being like this laboratory petri dish for thesis statements. And that's what this skill is teaching, is the ability for somebody to look at what 4 or 5 people are saying when they watch a movie and distill it into one kind of like critical observation about the film that's taking a position on the meaning of the film and using the conversation of other people in the class as the genesis of that idea. Does this make sense? Yeah.
Have you done the same sort of thing with text instead of film?
Yeah.
Do you have good results with that too?
Yes. Sometimes I've had people tweet their favorite sentence from a reading. And then we've pulled them up and said, why? Why did you pick that one? And sometimes I've had people, I've definitely had people like live tweet while they were reading, like take pauses in their reading and kind of document what they're thinking, like marking up a page. But the thing I've done more than either of those two things is when we're getting ready for a big project, I ask people sometimes to tweet their thesis. And then I ask everybody else to fold on top of that and kind of like work that thesis over. How would you tweak it? How would you change it? What are the problems going to be? What are the strengths of that thesis? And that I've done that whether we're looking at film or books or novels or academic essays or whatever. Yeah. The good thing about film though is that in this instance, like you can really access kind of like the visual component of the film if you go and this is like one of my favorite tweets of the semester, because how many people are familiar with this movie Memento? Okay, this picture right here, it happens for maybe 1 second or maybe 2 seconds in the film, but I watched the film, when it first came out, I watched the film 3 times before I saw this, and when I saw this frame, it changed everything that I thought about the film, because that frame actually can't happen if what you usually think about Memento is true, about whether he's actually got the condition that he's supposed to have. So I remember, like when the movie came out, I was so excited for myself. I'd watched it 3 times in the space of 1 week, and I was like, oh, this thing, and I was all like happy that I'd arrived at this critical observation. This student watched the film 1 time. He was probably doing 3 other things at the same time, and he was like, oh, that's a cool moment. Let me go find that on the internet. There's the picture, moving on. And I was like, that's it. Like, that's the whole film. That picture right there. His ability to just identify it in the film, find the picture, and say, has he really done it? That's massive. And then, let's not forget, there were at least 200 tweets about this film that weekend. It's no surprise to me why that tweet is the one that ends up in this critical analysis of, like, she's curating, he's curating, they're picking out the things that are like the most kind of interesting, controversial things about the film. I loved that moment. And she goes on and quotes the film and makes her argument, and then she's done.
And Pete, you're about done too.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. I'll just show this last thing. So this is an example of a collaboratively written annotated bibliography. So in my media narrative class, we spend about a month looking at podcasts, because students have heard of podcasts, but they're so new that we haven't kind of culturally wrapped our mind yet around like, what is the importance of this medium? So I want to kind of immerse them in that. And so we build this collaborative bibliography of podcasts where they go and find one, and they find somebody else describing it, and they listen to it, and then somebody else comes to the document. So this podcast is submitted by this student. This student has to come behind that student, listen to that podcast, and annotate the podcast. And after 2 semesters of doing this, there's 18 pages of, a variety of different kind of podcast series that exist. And everybody owns that document. Everybody has landed on that document. And when people have to go and write a kind of research-involved activity later, and they have to pick a podcast, they don't just have the 2 or 3 podcasts that they listen to. They have, 100 that the class has discussed collectively, and they can go and kind of pick off of that thing. To close, I'll say that it would be a whole other hour to talk about how web domains are a massive, massive version of these kinds of micro-literacies. Once you're working with, personally owned, managed web domains like you have with Reclaim Hosting, all of this kind of like potential opens up that you didn't have before when you were working on systems that were owned by other people. And then I have some quotes that are kind of boring.
I wanted to take your web domain segue into, you guys all have your own web domains, and we're going web domain, and we're going to invite you back for a summer workshop in the fall, in the summer in May 17th, should you want to learn about how to do that. So keep that in mind, and thank you.
Sure, thank you.